empathy is a skill set, right? It is a cognitive ability to imagine the reality of somebody else's perspective. Sympathy is an emotion. It's how I feel in response to that understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And then just for interest, compassion is an action.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Reflect Forward. I'm your host, Kerry Siggins, and I'm so glad you are here today. Today's conversation begins with one of the hardest moments in leadership, the moment when you have to sit across from someone and they're leaving the organization, whether you made the decision or it's simply no longer a fit for them. That conversation carries weight because there is livelihood involved, identity, culture, and the quiet understanding that you as a leader are both responsible for the human being in front of you and the health of the company. And that is the lens of this episode. I am joined by Mimi Nicklin, who is a global empathy advocate, a best-selling author, and the founder of Empathy Everywhere. Mimi has built her career around reframing empathy, not as kindness, but as a biological and cognitive capability that shapes how we lead, decide, and we connect. She speaks about the global cost of disconnection and why listening may be one of the most strategic leadership skills of our time. Today, we dive into empathy and how to do it better, why it's so important. And we talk a little bit about this hard decision that many of us have to make. What do we do when someone has to leave? How can we protect our standards and protect dignity at the same time? I asked the question, does empathy strengthen our decisions or does it complicate them? And what does leadership look like when performance and humanity collide? So hang tight, and I will be right back with Mimi. All right, everyone. I am back with my guest, the wonderful and beautiful Mimi Nicklin. Mimi, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
You are so welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yes. Okay. So every leader has to terminate somebody, and you're sitting in front of them, and you already know the decision you have to make. It's not working, and you're responsible for protecting the company, the team, and you know it's the right decision. And at the same time, you know that you are impacting this person's livelihood. So you have to hold this tension within you of, I know that this is the right decision and I need to make it, and I'm even okay with making it. And I also know that this is going to be hard for the other person to hear, that it's going to affect their lives. If you're like me, where you feel it in your body, oh, I don't want to do this, but I have clarity in my thinking of like, I know I have to do this. And I feel that dual responsibility to both the individual and to the organization. You say to yourself, I can feel empathy for this person. And I also know that this is the right decision for the company. And that is where I think in moments like this, that leadership feels the most complex. So you are an expert in empathy, and I want to dive into that a little bit more about how you came to be that. But I want to start with this duality. What is happening biologically and emotionally for that leader in that moment?
Gosh, it's such a good way to start, Kerry, because it is such a real example. And I think there's very few people who can just fire people and not feel it, because it doesn't only affect them, but their families, their lives, the rest of the team. I think when you ask about biologically and that connection between the physiological body and the emotional body, we're talking really about something called the fight or flight response that maybe you've heard of before, which is fundamentally the response from the brain to threat or fear. And it's how we've evolved to be. This response in our brains has been there from evolutionary times, right? It's how we evolved. And fundamentally, what it does is it protects you. The reptilian brain, the kind of the most basic human fundamental brain that we have, tells our bodies that when there is a risk or a threat to life, basically, in front of us, we need to respond differently. Now, the brain has evolved in all these amazing ways over the hundreds of thousands of years that we've been evolving. But the one thing that hasn't changed is this response. And the brain does not and cannot recognize what that risk is.
Mm-hmm.
So a fear response that evolved to protect us from a tiger in the jungle, when it comes out and you see that tiger approaching you and you think, I need to survive. The brain doesn't know today that that reality when you're potentially firing someone is not a tiger. It will respond in the same way to that threat because you're feeling anxious, because you're feeling worried, because all of these things are going around. So that emotional responsibility, perhaps there's some guilt, perhaps there's some fear that you feel through having that conversation. is going to lead to your body responding in the same way. Fundamentally, you're going to experience things like shaking, maybe sweating, your heart's going to beat faster, you might be out of breath, you might get a headache, all kinds of different ways that people respond to stress, because that is your brain responding to your emotional response to that reality. When that fight or flight response is active, it becomes very hard for us to use our empathy. The reason being, the brain is quite literally moving the blood, the energy away from the thinking parts of the brain towards the protective parts of our body. So maybe your limbs, so you can run away, your heart to beat faster, your lungs to pump more air through your body so that you can escape what was a tiger in evolutionary times. So what all of that means is that in order to be very intentional and present and empathetic in that environment, you have to really focus on doing that, because your body will naturally be in a fear state, which is why people often in those types of meetings say things that they don't really mean, or later they say, why did I say that? That was such a stupid thing to say, right? It's because the brain is responding differently, and you don't have quite literally as much of blood and energy in the thinking parts, the prefrontal cortex of your brain, which is responsible for that kind of cognitive thought and patterns and that type of thing, including empathy. So it is a physiological reality. So those feelings that you are experiencing when having those conversations are not like, I was going to say they're not in your mind. They actually are, right? It is coming from your brain. But what I mean is you're not making it up. It's not like, oh, you're being emotional. That is a neurological response to a stress. And it is very stressful to impact the lives of others, even if you say, Kerry, earlier, you've decided it's the right thing to do for the business, perhaps the wider team, maybe even them. So it is a very complex chemical, physiological, and neurological reality. And it does mean that you have to be quite intentional to use your empathy under stress or duress, which in the working world is quite a lot of our time.
Yes, I know. And you can go into this like self-justification mode of why being empathetic right now is inconvenient, because I think you do want to avoid that fight or flight feeling. And so it's like, let's just get this over with as fast as possible. So I'm going to just justify why this is important to the business and say empathy is just really inconvenient right now.
Yeah.
I found in my experience that when I approach these situations with empathy, and I imagine that I'm walking next to the person, because that's what you need to do. You need to allow them to have whatever emotional response that they're having, because yes, this is actually impacting their lives more than it is yours, at least in an ongoing state. You're both in that conversation at the same time. So how can I walk beside this person so that way that I don't look at empathy as being inconvenient, or
Yes.
I don't let empathy take over and turn into sympathy, backtrack or soften, or not just be really honest and direct with this person about what's going on. I like imagining I'm walking next to somebody so that I can keep myself grounded in empathy. It helps me stay really present.
Yeah, it does. And actually, what's really interesting that you were touching on there, Kerry, is that empathy is inconvenient to get out of that fight or flight response.
Yeah.
The fight or flight response is there anyway. So actually, the best way out of it is through empathy, because the fight or flight response is the response to the fear or the guilt or the emotion that you feel for making this decision. You can go as fast or as slow. It won't go away. It's already in your body, right? Of course, you can get the meeting over quicker. But I think the reality is, and I teach this a lot in my masterclasses, that to understand others, which is what we're talking about with empathy, to take the perspective of other people, it doesn't take a long time. I mean, it can, right? I could stay on this call with you for the next 8 hours to really understand your life, and that would take us 8 hours. But it doesn't take that long, especially in the types of meeting that we're talking about, to make eye contact, to intentionally listen to the response from the person, to understand how you're going to move forwards together, to be able to make those same decisions, i.e., fire them with empathy, with understanding, with data, human data. One of the exercises I do in my masterclasses shows people that you can listen in under 120 seconds. So you have 120 seconds, right, in those sessions. So I just wanted to kind of respond to that, because actually what we know from all kinds of data is that empathy increases your resilience. It also creates shared energy between you and the other people. So empathy is not just for them, it's also for you. You will feel better. That feeling you're trying to escape will improve quicker when you're connected. When you can look that person in the eye and say, listen, we have to have a really rubbish conversation today, because I am going to have to ask you to leave this organization, and I have only a small amount of idea of how much stress that's going to put in your life. I want to explain to you why I feel we have to make this decision, but I also want to listen to you today and understand how I can support you through that decision. I know you hate this decision. I quite hate it too, but we have to make it for these reasons. But while we're making it, how can I support you going through this? Do you need help finding a new role? Could I maybe look at your CV for you? Is there someone in my network that I might be able to move you on to? You change that conversation and actually give people the opportunity to come through this conversation in a way. It's going to be terrible. Being fired is like the worst thing, but you can do it with insight, with empathy, rather than with sort of brutal, cutthroat nature.
Yeah. That was brilliant, by the way. That was so well done. I think it's a great example for people listening to be able to have the hard conversation and still be empathetic. So thank you for that. And I can see why you are an expert in this. So tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you become so passionate and such an expert around this idea of empathy in leadership?
You know, Kerry, I think probably conversations like that made me realize a long time ago that, you know, there were other ways to be able to deal with the stresses of our lives that try to decrease some of that stress rather than increase it. In 2018, I took a role, a CEO role in the Middle East in Dubai. And the very short version of that long story is that when I moved to that country to take over that job, the business was, let's say, significantly less successful than I was led to believe. And the honest truth was I was entirely unprepared to turn around a small to medium business. I had been in corporate my whole life, surrounded by large teams, great support structures, finance and procurement, and people everywhere, right, to help you. And suddenly I felt like I was very alone with a team of about 40, which fundamentally was not going to survive unless we did significant shifts to that business. And I had no experience in that. And in that period, I went to see a business coach to ask her for advice, like what is going on here and how do I handle it? And in that conversation, she was asking me about my leadership at the time. And she asked me a question, which I now will never forget, because she said to me, give me one word that explains how you lead. And at the time, I said intuition. I am an intuitive leader. And she stopped me and she said, Mimi, is it intuition or is it empathy? And at the time, Kerry, I was like, no, no, it's not empathy. Like, what's empathy got to do with anything? But I left that meeting and I started to research what empathy is. And it was a little bit like, I felt like I had discovered something that, well, first of all, it definitely changed my life, but that I couldn't believe I had never seen in my leadership until that time. And I really discovered something called the empathy deficit, which actually Barack Obama coined in 2006, which is fundamentally talking to the lack of human connection in our world and our workplaces. And it felt like such a significant reality for our world that I didn't feel like I had found the elephant in the room. I felt like I had found like a mountain in the room, right? This huge issue impacting our workplaces, our society, our mental health, all kinds of things. And no one was talking about it because in 2018, 2019, no one like you was inviting me on their podcast, right? Okay. This was not a conversation then. 6 years now, nearly 6 years later, life has changed. And now this is a topic that the whole world is talking about. Last year, somehow I managed to meet 5 million people online around this content and literally have taken it from a conversation that literally nobody cared about to trying to create a movement around this, which re-educates people on what this is, because you touched on it earlier. This is not sympathy. This is not kindness. This is not pity. This is not being nice. It's good to be nice. The world needs us to be nice, but that's not what I'm talking about. Yeah, so it's been an amazing journey of just, I don't know, bringing the world with me a little bit, I guess.
I love it. And you just wrote a book, correct? Or your book is coming out?
Yes, it's my fourth book.
Fourth book. Nice.
Yeah, I'm really excited. It comes out in May 12th in New York. It's called The Connection Prescription. And this book really, based on the title, talks about how connection can be such a huge solution in our world. The role of belonging, why we need each other to survive, not just to thrive. There's so many conversations about longevity and how we live longer lives. And yet we so often underestimate that social cohesion, that belonging that is fundamental to being humans. We really don't, I mean, the data shows it. We do not live as long when we are alone. Actually, we die 8 years earlier if you are chronically lonely. So this is like a fundamental conversation to our survival, which is only just beginning, really. So yeah, all my books are around empathy, but this new one just pushes it slightly more into kind of social health and longevity as well, which is quite exciting.
So do you think that a person who identifies as unempathetic can build deep connections? And if you don't feel that you are a very empathetic person, how do you go about deepening your connection?
I touched earlier that it sits in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And because of that, like any skill, you can learn it. The more you practice it, the more permanent it becomes, the better you get at it. So if you feel that you find it hard to understand other people, to be patient, to be present, to authentically listen to people, if these are skills that you find hard, they're just skills you have to focus on, like really like riding a bike or cooking or any other skill in life. If you practice it, you get better at it. So yes, this is accessible to everyone. The other thing I would say is that you are born with this. There is a very tiny, 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 like 0.02% of the population who is born without empathy. Everybody else, you, your wife, your husband, your boss, your CEO, you all have the same amount of empathy. It's up to you, right? It's up to you to choose to use it. Can you have deep connections without it? I think probably not. Because if you don't know how to understand others, if you don't know how to listen, how can you build trust? How can you have strong relationships? You can have wide connections. I meet many amazing business leaders who travel the world and just seem to know everybody and everything. And then sometimes you'll sit and have a cup of coffee with them and they'll tell you how lonely they are. They don't have any friends. But yet, from the outside, you would feel that they are extremely socially connected, but it's wide and not deep. So you really do need to be able to master the art of listening, the art of connection, to be able to create really true and lasting relationships.
And what do you say to people who look at empathy as being soft, right? If I'm empathetic, then that means that I don't hold people accountable or that I lower my standards. So, how do you dispel that myth?
So I explain a lot, often, probably every day, that this is a hard skill. It is hard to master. It is hard to maintain, but it also has very hard business results. So we know that when you have higher levels of empathy in an organization, you see, for example, 21% higher sustained profits, 36% higher levels of output, 48% higher levels of innovation, 68% higher levels of engagement. And I could go on, Kerry. I mean, I could probably talk to you for another hour on data. There is endless data now that proves when people feel understood, when they feel valued, they work longer hours out of choice, they do better work, they take more well thought through risks, collaboration goes up, communication goes up, innovation goes up. There is nothing soft about it because fundamentally you're talking about driving performance in people. How can you drive performance if you don't understand them? How will you know what they want to perform? How will you know what benefits matter or how to lead them? So I always say to people, you cannot lead if you don't listen first. Because if you haven't listened, you don't understand your audience. How are you going to guide them or lead them or motivate them or empower them? So I think that there's many ways to answer your question to really dispel this myth that this is a soft skill. Because actually, there's no data to show that it's soft. It just happens to be some language that's left over from times gone by.
And maybe it's because people do confuse empathy with sympathy, because I think you have on the other side where you might identify as being an empath and you feel everything. And therefore, you don't want to necessarily have the hard conversation because I don't want to make this person feel bad, or making this person feel bad is going to make me feel bad. Therefore, I'm not going to have it. So, how do you help people who are on the opposite ends of the spectrum where they might fall into sympathy mode and over identify with that person's feelings or even take the person's feelings on themselves? How do you help them keep themselves in empathy so that they can walk beside that person and still maintain high standards, still make the tough decision, and not fall into, I'm taking this on. I am somehow responsible for how this person is feeling right now.
Yeah, Kerry, the only person that can fix that is you. And the reason I say that is that's really, and I hate the word boundaries because I think it's used far too much, but it is about being able to know what the boundaries are between these two realities. The reason I say that is so empathy is a skill set, right? It is a cognitive ability to imagine the reality of somebody else's perspective. Sympathy is an emotion, it's how I feel in response to that understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And then, just for interest, compassion is an action. So people often ask me the difference between the three, right? So we have empathy, which is a skill, sympathy, which is an emotion, and compassion, which is an action. The reason I say the only person that can manage those is you is because the only person that can manage your emotions is you. For me, I have obviously very high empathy, but I do also have very high sympathy. Because of that, I have various things in my life that I do to protect actually my empathy. Because if I allow my sympathy to take over my life, I wouldn't be able to do this work. I'll give you an example right now. We're at a time in world politics where there is war in the Middle East. A huge amount of my business and many of my best friends are there. If I spend all day looking at their stories and the news and everything else that's going on, I have so much sympathy, so much worry about what's going on. And this happened to me yesterday. Like 2 hours will go by and I do no work. Now, my work is to create empathy in the world, to try and fill the gaps. If I allow my sympathy to spiral, it takes away from the ability for me to do my work. And that would be the same for any leader. You need to make tough decisions. You need to lead a team when people have been fired, many other things. Maybe somebody's parents are sick and you feel awful for them, but they're not turning up to work. In the end, something has to change. I can't tell you how sad I am that your parents are sick, but you have to come to work, right? This job needs doing. The only person that can manage the two is you, and it is very intentional. It takes practice and it takes quite a lot of decision making.
Yeah, it seems to me that the focus needs to be around nervous system regulation. And so if you find yourself falling into that sympathetic mode, then nervous system regulation, I think, is key. I don't have to feel somebody's pain to be able to walk beside them. If I am choosing to feel that pain and take it on as my own, what's going on inside my body? What's going on inside of my nervous system?
I think often it's about being able to see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And that also takes intention and sort of taking a step back. I do quite a lot of work in very underprivileged areas in Africa, for example. If you only are able to focus on the micro, again, life becomes very overwhelming. You have to be able to look at the macro and say, if I can't move past this one child, I can't help 30. Yes, it's about being able to regulate a system, but the path I take to doing that all the time, in fact, every day, is to be able to see the bigger picture. And I think as an entrepreneur or a solopreneur, there are so many difficult days, right? There are so many slow days or days when you're running a podcast and maybe the guest doesn't turn up or any of these things that happen. And if you allow yourself to sit in that micro, you can't achieve the bigger goals that you need to go and do because you're absorbed in that sympathy, whether it's for others or yourself. So I think it is about your system, but it's about your mindset. And that can be really tiring, but it can also be really powerful.
Well, I think that goes back to the termination conversation that we were having earlier and why zooming out is so incredibly important. Because if it really is about that person, I say this because I've made this mistake where I feel so much empathy or sympathy for this person that I'm trying to figure out how to make it work for them. And so you prolong something or avoid having the hard discussion or making the hard decision. And then when you zoom out and you look at how is this really affecting the organization? And my responsibility as a leader is to make sure that my entire team is healthy, that the culture of the company is healthy. And I think that helps you go, okay, even though I don't want to make this decision, it's hard. I don't want to have this conversation because I do feel so badly for this person. I have to for the benefit of my organization. When I'm helping young leaders or even leaders who are seasoned who really struggle with difficult conversations or terminations or things like that, where it's going to affect people's livelihoods, I always try to help them zoom out. So I'm really glad that you gave that example, because we as leaders have to do that. We cannot focus on just this one situation or just this one individual. We have to think about the health of the entire team or organization.
I think as mums, we do it all the time, right? Like as mums or parents, we constantly suffer pain for our children, right? Whether that is small or big, whether it is small, like something inconvenient, or big, like the other day, my daughter accidentally hit me in the face with her doll, which literally hurt. But there are pains in parenting all the time, which we move through. And as you said, we take a bigger picture. We understand that they're only small for a short time and it's really hard to get them to do their homework, but it's part of their greater growth. Somehow, when we are leading our families, we find that much easier. That would be the first thing that I would say. And the second thing that comes to mind is that you touched on there, you want to solve for other people. Yeah. And that's very natural and it's very well intentioned, right? Because you want to help. But most people don't want you to solve their problems, not really. They might appreciate you listening to them. But, I often say to leaders I work with, this is about acknowledgement and not action. As leaders, we're so often in a cycle of stress and speed and pressure. We think that our jobs are to solve and solve and solve and fix and fix and fix, but they're not, right? More often than not, what people need from you, just like your children, is acknowledgement, is recognition, is your listening. They can fix it themselves. And again, back to children, don't even try to fix it. You can't fix what's happening in the playground because you've never been in that playground. And for us to compare what it was like when we had recess, and let's be honest, a lot has changed since yesterday, let alone in the last 30 years. So we cannot solve their problems. And therefore, most of the time, we don't try. But somehow when it's other adults, we make the assumption that we understand their reality and it's our responsibility to fix their reality. But of course, it's not. It's definitely a balance of that kind of insight, really.
Yeah, I like that. I think that we identify as being problem solvers as leaders. And usually we're in individual contributor roles before solving problems, before we're in a leadership role. And so we take that with us of I have to solve this problem. And it isn't. Your number one job as a leader is to help people realize and remember their full potential, not you coming in and solving it for them. So I think that is a maturation process that we all have to go through as leaders so that we don't feel like we have to fix everything or solve everything all the time. So another question, I have noticed over my 20 years of running a company, I came in when I was very young, 28, to run Stone Age. Humanity's collective wound is I am not enough, but my I'm not enough manifests itself in I need to be likable and I always need to prove myself. So this likability factor combined with I need to prove caused me to, I don't want to say avoid making hard decisions because I made a lot of hard decisions, but it caused me a lot of stress. And I didn't always say what needs to be said. Now, as I have been doing this for so long and having these more difficult conversations is easier, I sometimes wonder, am I numb to the hard decisions that I've had to make? Because I've made so many of them. And I always know that the outcomes are going to be okay. Like people are always going to be okay. I'm always going to be okay. In fact, sometimes making hard decisions like terminating somebody can be the most amazing thing that ever happened to that person. You just don't know. You can tell yourself a story. So I find myself being able to say, this is the decision that we have to make. And I can still be empathetic. I don't feel it as strongly. So do you think that repeated hard decisions do numb leaders over time?
I'm really thinking about that question. I think that the stress of making them probably does, not the decisions themselves. Again, I'm really thinking on my feet, Kerry, but I think when I think about my experience and when I listen to yours, it's not the decisions themselves. They were hard, but like you said, everybody was fine, right? We have to make hard decisions every day. I believe that what is making us numb is the consistent and perpetual nature of the hard decisions. Some of them that we're making and some of them, which is probably worse, we are not empowered to make about our countries, about our communities, about politics or social change or religion or any other big thing that matters in our lives, right? I feel that that is what makes us numb. It's just too much. Never has there been a time in history where we have such sustained high stress in our world. I mean, today there are 400 million people with depression. 400 million, right? In my work, I use this piece all the time. We have 335 million people who say they don't have a single friend. So we have a loneliness epidemic, which is a huge part of why I do the work that I do. We just have lost connection to ourselves, to our communities, to the people we work with. So I think that the stress and the loneliness is creating a lot of that numbness, not the decisions themselves. I think on the whole, most people, especially if they've become a leader or started a business, I think starting a business is probably one of the most joyful but hardest things I've ever done when it comes to tenacity, and people talk a lot about resilience because it's a very trendy word, but I always talk about tenacity, which is not resilience is to bounce back from those hard times. Tenacity is just to keep going through them. And when I talk about this, particularly with women, with female leaders, often they'll say to me, that point you made about tenacity, I had never thought about that, but that's true. We don't have it anymore. I'm like, no, I know we don't, because it takes such amount of energy and practice to get it right that I think the result might be that numb feeling. I'm just tired, right? I'm tired of hard decisions. I don't feel that I'm moving, progressing through them. And again, when we go back to evolution, as humans, in order to be motivated, in order to thrive, we have to be in motion, right? That's why people always talk about finding a purpose. Now, purpose doesn't have to be saving the world, right? Purpose can be running a small business successfully with you and one other person. When those hard decisions stop your growth, when they become debilitating and you're not moving, that can very quickly spiral into that numbness or that exhaustion, or in the worst cases, depression, because you are not able to move. The decisions are paralyzing your progress. So I think it's quite a complex reality, but there are so many to make, right? Every day, I feel like we have hard decisions every time we wake up in the morning.
That's for sure. Yeah, I really like that reframe around stress. I asked that question because it does get easier to make the hard decisions, because I think a lot of them too, when you put it into context, it was like, how consequential is this? Going through COVID, for example, I had to make insanely hard decisions. That was one of the most stressful times in my life. Right before COVID, we also got ransomware attacks. So we got hacked. So two of the most stressful things I've ever had to go through in business were back to back. And getting through that and having the tenacity, I absolutely have tenacity. I really like that reframe as well. But getting through those two things, it's like this, what we're dealing with right now, child's play.
Yeah.
And so I think the context of how you handle stress, you get better at it as long as you're doing the work, the nervous system work, and ensuring you're not getting burnt out. Like, I just don't get stressed about the things that I used to get stressed out, because it's like I've been through way harder things than this in particular. So, maybe it isn't a numbing that happens, although I do think that happens, but I do think that maybe our tolerance for stress increases, and therefore it doesn't feel as consequential in the whole scheme of things, because we've had to lead through so much volatility.
I guess it's stating the obvious, but it's experience, right?
Yeah.
It's experience. And, yesterday I had was it yesterday? I think it was the day before. One of those days that it was just a difficult day. The Uber didn't come on time and the coffee spilt, and just one of those days, right? And even my daughter, who's only 8, she looks at me and she's like, "Mummy, are you okay?" And I said, "No, not really. This is a really frustrating day." And I had a discussion with her. I mean, they're so small, these are small, small things, but how they make you feel. What I'm trying to do with her is give her the gift of experience to know what that feels like. So you also know how to fix it. Because I think in my 20s, I would sit in that discomfort because I didn't even recognize it as discomfort. And I certainly didn't know how to fix it. But all these years later, I think I'm much better at that, right? At knowing, hang on, this is not working for me. I need to significantly shift this day. Otherwise, it's going to linger now for the next 8 hours, right? I need to make very different decisions about how I'm going to run my morning in order to kind of stop the flow and do something else. But you have to practice that. Like you said, those difficult decisions, they get better as you get more experience, but you have to be very conscious about learning from experience, because otherwise you're just going to, you see it all the time. People who are still making the same mistakes as they were 20 years ago, they haven't learned from that because it's painful to learn. But once you learn, you can make things much better.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, I could talk to you all day, but I know that you have to get your daughter to school. So I want to ask you my signature question before we learn how people can find you if they want to work with you and learn more about your book. But the name of this podcast is Reflect Forward. What does Reflect Forward mean to you?
Oh, that's such a good question. Do you know why I love that question? Because I feel like I have to do it every single day because I'm building something. While I'm not directly answering your question as to a definition of what it is, I can tell you how it feels, right? So reflect forward to me feels like a constant journey to progress. That tenacity that I just spoke about, it's the reason I can speak about it because I feel like I live in it every day. Every day, there are small moments in my journey that reassure me, that help me reflect forward, that I am doing the right thing, right? That people do need this work, that the world needs this work, that we do need more empathy. And I'm not just making it up. So I think reflect forward is a practice, actually, for me, Kerry. It's that ability every day, as we just touched on just now, to take the small things and say, hang on, that one email from somebody called Kerry who messaged me from around the world and invited me to her show is a moment that says you need to keep going, to find that tenacity, to spend more money, to invest in your platform. So I think reflect forward is a practice, and it's one that, I don't know, I think it probably saves my business every day because I have to keep doing it, because otherwise it's just too hard, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I love that answer. Absolutely love it. Okay, so if people wanted to find out more about you, about your books, about your work, to work with you, how would they find you?
Well, my name is Mimi Nicklin, and they can find me basically anywhere. So if you look for me on LinkedIn or Instagram, particularly, I'm very active there. Or they can come to my website, which is www.empathyeverywhere.co. My books are all on Amazon and bookstores and all those things. So I hope to meet you all there.
I will include all of that in the show notes. And thank you for having this very enlightening conversation with me today. I know my listeners will get so much out of it. So thank you for coming and sharing your expertise.
Thank you very much. And hopefully we'll stay in touch.
Yes, we will. All right. Hang tight, everybody. I'll be right back. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on this show. I really appreciated everything that Mimi said. There's something that was really clarifying for me in this conversation, and that is that when someone leaves an organization, especially when I'm the one initiating it, I can feel those two truths at once. I can feel compassion for the human being in front of me, and I can feel conviction about what the organization needs. And for the longest time, I believed that these two forces were always in tension, and that empathy might soften my resolve, or that decisiveness might harden my heart or make me numb, like we talked about. But what I think is important is that whole idea of regulation. When I am regulated and more grounded, I can deliver that hard decision without dehumanizing someone. I can honor their contribution and still say that it's not the right fit. I can protect the company without becoming cold. That is what empathy is. And this deep work is internal. I hope that you gained something from this conversation today, because the reality is that leadership will always require difficult decisions that will never change. But what can evolve is who you are while you're making those decisions. And leading with empathy is where the work is. So, with that, I will leave you to your day. If you think that someone could benefit this episode on empathy, please feel free to share it with them. And if you like this podcast, go over to YouTube or your favorite podcast platform and subscribe to it. Leave me a comment, leave me a review. I always appreciate it. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week.